Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Patty Ferguson-Bohnee. I'm from the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe, and I teach at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, 2 blocks from here. So if you'd like to come visit our law school, we'd be happy to give you a tour. The 2 speakers before me mentioned the importance of the right to vote, and I just want to echo that this right to vote wouldn't be realized without the sacrifices of our veterans. As you know, Native Americans have served and continue to serve in greater numbers than any other group in the military. And but for their service, the Congress would not have passed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. Even though that law was passed, Natives were prevented from voting and from registering. But it was Native veterans who fought for registration and filed lawsuits to ensure that other people could also vote. So I think that we should also always acknowledge our veterans in the voting battle that we have. So this right to vote is a continuing struggle, and we must be vigilant to protect the right. The Voting Rights Act has helped to overcome some of these struggles, but not all. There are continuing efforts to suppress the vote. And so we must take active measures to enforce this right. Some of the major issues to be aware of are efforts to reduce polling places on the reservation, changing voting to all mail-in voting, the lack of equal access to early voting, the lack of in-person voter registration as compared to off-reservation voters, the lack of access to translated materials for elections, and voter ID laws. As other speakers have mentioned, with our vote, we have a voice, and Native Vote has successfully impacted election results across the country. And in order to participate, we have to register, we have to turn out, but then we also have to protect the vote. So in Arizona, we created the Arizona Native Vote Election Protection Project. And this was really created as a partnership between the Intertribal Council of Arizona, the Indian Legal Clinic, the Native American Bar Association of Arizona, and the National Congress of the American Indian. And that was created because in Arizona, we passed a voter ID law. We had grandmas who had never had an ID before, never needed an ID, who were not able to vote. They spoke their native language. They were born in a hogan. They don't have electricity. And they went to the polls to vote on election day and were turned away. And this was very discouraging, so that during the next election, some of these grandmas didn't show up because they didn't want to be turned away. They were embarrassed. One grandma, we helped her in obtaining an ID because she was so determined to have that ID so she could vote. Because she started voting in the 1970s when Native Americans in Arizona were finally allowed to vote. We drove 2.5 hours to Tuba City. Someone drove an hour and a half to pick her up and another 2.5 hours to meet us in Tuba City so she could try to get an ID at the Department of Motor Vehicles. And when we arrived there, the Department of Motor Vehicles did not issue photo IDs. They only issued paper IDs. And in Arizona, that's not sufficient to receive a regular ballot. So we drove another hour and a half to Flagstaff with her to try to obtain her ID. And when she arrived, as she had tried twice before, the people at the Department of Motor Vehicles told her no. But I was there, and our law team was there, and we said, no, you have to issue her an ID with her affidavit of birth from the Navajo Nation. But if we had not been there, they would not have issued her an ID, as they had denied her twice before. So we had litigation in Arizona because Native Americans have been disproportionately impacted by this voter ID law. And we settled the litigation by expanding the types of IDs that Natives can use to vote with on election day. But a lot of times the counties did not advise individuals and the Native voters of this expanded types of ID. So as Native communities, we need to make sure that we're ensuring that our voters know what they need when they vote on election day. I just want to mention that last year, the Native American Voting Rights Coalition was founded to secure equal access to Native American voters across the country, and this includes participating in the political process and to elect candidates of choice. Members of this team include the Native American Rights Fund, the National Congress of American Indians, the ACLU, the Indian Legal Clinic, the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, and the Intertribal Council of Arizona, as well as others. And people within this team have been sharing information, and this has to do with access to the ballot and also protecting the vote. And some examples include ensuring language translations for native speakers, such as NARF has done in Alaska, bringing litigation to expand early voting and same-day registration in Montana, South Dakota, and Nevada, and that's been done through 4 directions. Litigation to overturn voter ID laws, as NARF recently did in North Dakota, or meeting with county officials to ensure that voters are not discriminated against because they live on the reservation, as Governor Lewis did here in Arizona with Pinal County. We have to be proactive to protect the native vote, and that includes us taking measures to educate voters, educate state and local offices so that we can empower our voters. So we have to make requests to our counties because counties do not change anything unless we ask or they're forced to do it through litigation. And this is something that we know because they know that our votes make a difference. But we need to ensure that that right is protected. In Arizona, we have 9 counties that are covered for language translations, and I would tell you that those counties are not translating every part of the ballot and every part of the political process, and they should be doing that. And tribes that are covered by language provisions of the Voting Rights Act across the country should be asking the counties to follow that law, because that is the federal law. Also, I want to remind everyone that as a voter, sometimes poll workers are wrong, and also states and counties are wrong. So we have a national hotline number to protect the native vote, and that information I think is going to be shared shortly. But in Arizona, we have our own hotline number, and if you call the hotline number, we'll have someone from our team answer that number, and we'll also have people out on the reservations on election day. But it's very important that tribes also designate legal counsel to serve as election protection volunteers and to work with local law students to also participate in that. So things to think about on election day, because we do have rights, and even though the poll workers may not be enforcing those rights, we need to empower our people to know what those are. The first and most important is that no one can be turned away from the polls on election day. Under federal law, everyone should receive a ballot, and you have the right to receive that ballot. And if they do not give you a regular ballot, they must give you a provisional ballot and give you information on how to check to see whether that ballot is counted. Polling places, if they're not issuing ballots or not open or try to close early, you need to call a hotline. If you're in line and at the time the polls close, they must allow you to vote. The polling locations must be accessible for handicapped voters. You must be aware that you can bring anyone of your choice to assist you to vote on election day. This could be a child, this could be a friend, it could be an election protection worker on the outside. You can bring anyone other than your union representative or your employer. But if you're covered for language translations, then they must provide language translation assistance for you. If your state doesn't have an ID requirement, they cannot ask for your ID because they don't know how to say your name, okay? They cannot place a time limit on how long it takes for you to vote. If there is police presence and they're stopping people within the polls or outside the polls or just being there, then that can be seen as voter intimidation, okay? If there's other voter intimidation or harassment, then that's also a violation. If you were told you cannot bring in your pre-marked election material, that is wrong. Okay, if any of these things happen, I encourage you to call the voter hotline. So we have a native vote hotline, and I encourage you to use it. And if you actually have election protection volunteers on your reservation, I encourage people to talk to those individuals, because we want to make sure that everyone votes, but also that the vote counts. So we have to stay vigilant, ensure that these rights are protected, and to continue to fight to ensure that these rights are not denied. I want to also recognize I have my Indian Legal Clinic students here. If you could just stand up, they're working on our election protection project, and they're also, yes, they're also registering people to vote. As Maria mentioned, today is the voter registration deadline in Arizona, and since it's a federal holiday, you actually couldn't postmark that by today, but the deadline is midnight, and if you need help, we can help you, okay? So I just encourage everyone to get out to vote and just to make sure that that vote counts. Thank you.